Welcome back to this week's episode of Green Enterprise, a partnership between my company, Digital Venture Partners, a minority-founded portfolio company focusing on cannabis and Black enterprise, where every week I have a conversation with Black or brown founders that I think are making progressive strides in cannabis, and I want them to share their story and their perspective with the viewers. Today we have Rachel Bradley and Rene Chatfield of Dope Girls Consulting. How are you ladies doing today?
Doing good. Happy to be here.
Yeah, definitely. I genuinely appreciate it. I kind of saw some of the editorial stuff circulating around you guys' agency, and I was really excited to have a conversation with you. But before that, I would love for you to give us a quick introduction on yourselves and kind of what was your professional background before you decided to make that jump into cannabis.
Yeah, thank you first for having us. This is an exciting opportunity to kind of share our story as well as hopefully inspire others. Rene Chatfield here, born and raised Maryland girl, spent the last 20 years in Georgia. I have spent probably about 18 of those 20 years in the sports industry. I have a plethora of sports marketing experience. I've worked for the WNBA, the NBA, and most recently Nike as the basketball brand director. So I've decided to take a leap of faith and join my dope girl buddy over there, Rachel, in Chicago. I'm currently actually in Atlanta and she's based in our Chicago office, but join forces with her to build an amazing opportunity and hopefully inspire some other Black and brown people along with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rachel Bradley here. My, professional experience over the last 15 years has really been in the integrated experiential marketing space. So building large scale consumer facing events for brands such as Nike, Verizon, Samsung. And really kind of landing in the area of expertise of branding and product launches. So, in addition to just my own personal history and story with cannabis, this was really kind of the next step and perfect next phase in my career as it relates to bringing my marketing experience into the cannabis industry.
Okay, great. So my first thought after hearing that, what does your agency kind of accomplish in the cannabis space? Like when you are taking on a new project or a new client, what do you hope to fulfill for them within the cannabis space?
Yeah, so I think for us, as we have gone through the process of breaking into the cannabis industry, that's kind of like our lingo, we thought about pulling others with us and what essentially that would look like, especially the Black and brown and minority community and women. Too much that there's a stigma around men in cannabis or men in weed or men in marijuana, however you want to label it. So we thought, like, you know what, if the men are out there and they're getting into cannabis industry legally, we want to bring others with us and we want them to come along with us. So we want to essentially expand our network and, reach into our network to help support us as we go along this journey, and we build our brands and we build our cannabis empire.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that I think that we've seen in our own personal journey that there is power in numbers. We're stronger together than we are alone. And, our own personal community, as we've been really building this brand and this agency, has been invaluable to us. And we want to be able to create that space, that home for others, that they can go and instantly have a place that's going to empower them and help them and lead them along the way.
Hearing your story and kind of some of the large brands and corporations that you've worked with, in cannabis, we don't have any of those yet, right? We don't have a Coca-Cola or a Verizon or a WNBA of cannabis, right? Because of so many restrictions and just the youth of the legal industry. How do you think a company has to operate to get to that level of sustainability and success in cannabis?
I would say that there's a level of professionalism that needs to be seen in any industry, in any market, right? And so one of the things that I've personally noticed as I, was looking to transition into this industry and really kind of researching the brands that were out there is that you've got kind of like your street brands, right? Someone that wants to just jump into the cannabis industry, they go all in. Potentially they don't have a strong logo. They don't have a strong, digital background in terms of their website presence, and just really being able to take those very small things that establish a brand presence and a brand personality and bring them into this industry, I think is going to be huge. You know, when you think of the Nikes of the world, when you think of the Samsungs or the Apples of the world, they have a very strong brand personality. They've got a very iconic logo. You know exactly who they're marketing to. And I think that that's really kind of where there's an area of opportunity for a lot of the brands out there in the cannabis space, is to be able to navigate that area and really start to strongly brand themselves and put them in a place where we can look at them as the, you know, Nikes and Apples of the world.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, that the other piece that the Nikes, the Googles, the Apples, the Samsungs of the world, the things that they have done really well, especially the Nike, just because I came from there, but the storytelling. I mean, they do an amazing, phenomenal job of storytelling. And as you know, in our community and our people, we have the stories. We are the culture. So it's essentially bringing those things aligned with exactly what Rachel mentioned, as well as telling those stories and, you know, highlighting the positive stories into the legal cannabis industry, and really focusing on that versus all of the negative stigmatism that has been around our community and essentially what has, you know, brought us down, and really so taking that and bringing us up and highlighting us.
The perpetual story you see in cannabis for Black people is just the trauma, right? How it affected our communities, how it was criminalized, and how we were hyper targeted to be, you know, the people who had to bear the brunt of the war on drugs, right? But there are also other stories within cannabis that aren't talked about or covered. So I really am excited to hear someone else who has that perspective, because I was starting to think that that was all people wanted to see from us, right? I think we should see every vantage point of our relationship with cannabis for it to actually penetrate the mainstream. But my second question to follow up with that would be, how do you actually maneuver to that point? Because we all know that cannabis is federally illegal. We can't really do traditional marketing tactics, right? It's certain strategies that we kind of took for granted. I came from the music industry, things that we were able to do a couple of years ago in our former industries that we can't really do in cannabis now.
Right.
How do you think companies need to know how to kind of work around those restrictions until it's federally legal?
I think it's doing exactly what you're doing. It's really, again, supporting each other, supporting the platforms that we already have now, and highlighting the positive stories. I mean, Al has an amazing story that Al Harrington, with the CEO or the brand ambassador and founder of Viola, he has an amazing story around his grandmother, and essentially how he really wasn't an avid user, but you know, his grandmother really inspired him to essentially provide another opportunity for her, and essentially it had cured her. You know, I have a very similar you know, situation with my mother-in-law. Unfortunately, she passed, but during her days and her fight against cancer, she didn't have an appetite, and we actually relied on her medical card and cannabis, and essentially it gave us more time. And so it's really highlighting those positive stories. It's supporting platforms like yours and all the others out there, and pushing the media so that they will focus on the positive and highlighting those stories instead of the negative.
Yeah. And I would say just using our voices, right? Not, you know, there was a point in time where I was afraid to post anything on LinkedIn about cannabis because I didn't know how that was going to affect, you know, my corporate career. I, you know, kept my circle very small on who knew that I, you know, used cannabis for a point in time, because you just don't know how that stigma could potentially follow you around. And that's not my perception, but that's others, you know, that's others' perceptions on who you are as a person, what you can contribute. And so I think just being very honest and vulnerable about our stories, like, you know, that is in my opinion, this is a narrative that isn't anything new, right? Like, we've had negative ideas and negative perceptions on who Black people are in the media for as long as, you know, there has been a media. So now that we are able to have a voice, have these types of platforms to speak on who we are. Hey, my name's Rachel and I smoke cannabis, and I also do all these other things, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a stigma around it. I think that, you know, it starts with people being vocal and being honest and open about, you know, what cannabis has done for them in their life.
I agree. I think with like black and brown platforms like this, we have the opportunity to shape our own narrative, because I think the narrative up until now is either you're a criminal if you smoke weed, or you're just a lazy stoner, right? Because that's what has been perpetuated in mainstream media. So I think the first step and the most important step is for us to have meaningful platforms where we can create our own content, where we can tell our own stories. But that leads me kind of into my next question about you guys' project. How long have you guys been in business with the consulting agency? And a second part of that question I would love to add on is, how did the COVID crisis kind of reshape you guys' direction in 2020?
Yeah, all really great questions. I think initially when we were talking about, how are we going to get into cannabis, our thought process was really around, building out a product line. But what we quickly realized is that we've got a lot to learn in that space, but we can immediately transfer our marketing skills and our branding skills into cannabis now. So how do we utilize that skill set and really beginning to have these types of conversations, beginning to help develop other brands and other companies that are getting into this space, and then having some sort of impact on who is coming into the space, right? Like, our mission really is to help other female and minority owned brands tap into the cannabis industry, because there's not a ton of support out there. As much as people like to talk about social equity, and there's all of these states having these social equity programs, it's still very expensive. So how do you get the money? How do you even start having conversations around money? And so for us, I think that it was really about figuring out what we could do now. And for us, that really was staying within that marketing space.
Rachel and I were hustlers, right? And we talked about our strategy and our plan, to getting into the cannabis industry. It was a product line, but it was also, what else can we do while we're essentially building this product line? So the consulting firm, it's fairly new. Right now our bandwidth is her and I. However, we're very quickly growing and building our team. But it's essentially like, what else can we be doing while we're building a product line, and essentially waiting for Illinois to stop pushing back the deadlines and distributing those licenses due to COVID. So you asked about COVID. We were essentially supposed to get our license awarded to us in July, and I'm speaking that into existence so that we know it happens. But we're up against hundreds of applications, like many are in the state of Illinois. So while we're waiting for that, we decided we're going to get out there. We're going to fundraise between our friends and family. We're going to market ourselves as a reputable brand, and two females that the Illinois should invest in as much as we're investing in the state of Illinois. And also, we're going to figure out how to pull our people with us, and that essentially is how Dope Girls Consulting was born.
Because I think the most important talent you have to have in cannabis is the ability to pivot. Because the thing that's so different about our industry is that there's so much you have no control over, right? If you're in retail, or if you're touching the plant, you have to worry about state legislation, the local legislation, law enforcement, taxation, certain parameters that you do not have to worry about in anything else. So it's like, if you do not successfully figure out how to adapt and change and kind of take what the situation is giving you, you will not last within cannabis. Anybody who comes in saying, hey, I'm going to do this, and this is how I'm going to do it, they never last, right? Because it's like, you didn't take into account all the factors that you have no control over, like applying for a license and then a pandemic hitting and then telling you you're just going to have to wait, right? So
yes, talk about it.
Right. So I would love for you ladies to touch on a little bit more specifically what kind of licenses exist in the Illinois market that people are applying for, and what specifically you feel like you would benefit from having a particular license.
So I think when you talk about pivoting, I mean, essentially that's what the marketing world is. You're always figuring out how to pivot and how to be better than the next guy. And so essentially with a plant like cannabis, that is the most dynamic plant in the world and has the capabilities of, medical advances. People are building roads apparently with it, and clothing. And so now we have adult use opportunities that essentially will be federally. I think it's a matter about figuring out what lane you want to get in, and staying there and strategizing and building a plan, and really figuring out, okay, if one thing doesn't work, how do I essentially look at a different avenue, and not give up. So I think for us, it's really about, taking advantage of the opportunities. Essentially, we have an opportunity to write our own laws and our own certifications and be a part of all of that. And I think it is getting in early and figuring out where you fit in the industry. Maybe it's not a dispensary owner. Maybe it's not a grower. Maybe it's a marketing rep. Maybe it's working in the labs. Maybe it's using your food and using those skills and essentially applying those to the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to touch on the second part of your question, here in Illinois for the wholesale licenses, essentially, those looking to get into cannabis had three different avenues as it relates to wholesale licenses. They have the craft grow license, the infuser license, so making any type of products that are infused with THC. And then there was also the transporter license. So we certainly navigated through that process. The licensing process is a beast all on its own as it relates to just a very small part of the cannabis industry. So, within Dope Girls Consulting, we went after transporter licenses and infuser licenses.
Okay. Did they give any update on like what the status is in Illinois, like when they may have, award the actual licenses, or is it still pretty much just up in the air?
It's still up in the air, and just to kind of give you an idea of timeline, the first series of licenses that they were supposed to award were the recreational dispensary licenses. That announcement was supposed to come out on May 1st, and they still haven't announced those licenses yet. But we do know that they are working on the wholesaler licenses. We've been in communication with the state about various things within our application. So we know that they're working on it. We just don't really know when those licenses will be awarded.
And how long was this process for you? When did you start? When did you ladies make up your mind, like, hey, we're going to apply for this license seriously? And then what was kind of that roadmap to actually getting your application submitted? Because people have no idea how arduous a process it is to apply for a license.
So I think that's a super fun story. Rachel and I met while I was working at Nike, and she was actually on the agency side supporting some of the work that I was doing as the basketball brand director. And essentially when I left that role and moved back to Atlanta, that role was actually housed in Chicago. I left and came back to Atlanta. Within maybe about, 4 or 5 months later, she called me. She says, hey, I'm coming to Atlanta and I want to talk to you about an idea. And I'm like, oh gosh, this crazy girl and her ideas. But I was excited. I hadn't seen her in a while, so I was excited. And literally from that day on, we have been joined to the hip. I mean, she presented the idea that she had been working on for about 6 years. And I was like, I was just talking to my husband about getting into cannabis and I hadn't figured out a plan. She had the plan. So we decided to join forces and kind of decide to get in it together. And in January, many commas in, I'm not going to say how much money we spent, but a lot of commas and, a lot of nights and sleepless nights, and 1,300, or I think it was like 2,600 pages later, we submitted our application, which essentially was due at the end of January. So as much as that might sound like an overnight process, it was not. There was a lot of thought into that. Obviously, her building the brand within that time that she did a lot of that research, and then into the finally pulling the trigger on applying, which is a lot of dollars invested, a lot of time, a lot of lawyers and consultants to help us build the application, and kind of pulling in all of those resources into essentially applying for the license itself.
Yeah. And I think that there's something to be said for, there's a large part of us that just feels like this is our purpose, right? There have been a ton of things that have fallen into place that we had no idea how they were going to fall into place, and they just did. They've worked out. I think that's part of the reason why we feel so strongly and so passionate about helping others, because we wouldn't be in this place today if we didn't have others helping us, whether that was paid others that went above and beyond what we paid them for, or, just, networking and people that we met along the way. And so I think a big part of it was just like, we are in the space we're supposed to be right now, and things are opening up because of that.
Did you ladies apply for a social equity license or just like a regular license? Social equity.
Yeah, we applied under the Illinois Social Equity Program, which I think still has a lot of room for growth. And, it's the first year, so TBD on how all of that is going to shake out. But yes, we did apply under the Social Equity Program.
Moving forward to federal legalization, it's interesting because a lot of entrepreneurs we have conversations with feel like federal legalization may be negative for Black people, right? Because there may not be any explicit verbiage in the bill once it's federally legalized. Do you feel like overall there's going to be a benefit for our industry if and when it becomes federally legal? Or do you feel like we need to better position ourselves up until that point?
I think there's a couple of ways you can look at that, right? From the lens of, federal legalization potentially bringing additional sight and decreasing stigma around the cannabis plant, as well as potentially bringing in dollars to help support research around cannabis. I think that's a good thing. When you take a look at whether or not it will be good for our industry as it relates to minorities in cannabis, I think it could potentially be a negative. We all know that in order for legislation to pass, there has to be compromise. I don't think that we'll have the same opportunity to get as detailed with social equity programs the way states have been able to break off and do it on the state level. But that's all still TBD. I mean, I think the goal and the hope is, considering it's still potentially several years away, that we will have enough states participating in this industry and have enough trial and error that we can take the good, the bad, and the ugly and figure out a plan that could work across the nation. So we'll see.
Yeah, and again, ditto what Rachel says. And I think the biggest thing is let's control the narrative, right? Let's continue. We know it's inevitable. It will eventually, our federal government will want to tap into those dollars just like the states have. So we know that's headed that way. But as the more of us join forces and support each other and control the narrative, the more we can see this impact our communities in that positive light that we're looking forward to.
Okay. And lastly, I'll pose you ladies with the question that I get asked often. I'm sure you get asked every day. For the young Black or brown entrepreneur who is thinking, I want to transition my skills into cannabis. I want to open a dispensary, as you say. That's like the most common question you get, right? What's that answer that you give to that young person who's saying, I really want to jump into cannabis? What advice would you give me?
Renee,
Yeah.
You want to jump on this one?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is really figure out where you think you can fit in any industry and then apply it to cannabis. That's the best part about cannabis is right now, because it's so new and open, essentially you have to think strategically and say, okay, if I'm in marketing and I work in sports, I can do that in cannabis. And how does that essentially work? It's the same way as figure out what industry or get a job and maybe do something completely different from the industry that you're in and maybe start from the ground up. I mean, we all know that's how essentially we got to where we are today, Andrew. I'm sure you've worked some lower level, jobs in your day just to get to where you are at the big time seat now that you're hosting your own show. So I think it's just a matter of figuring out what you're interested in and apply it to cannabis. I mean, that's the great part about the industry being so young and new, that you can essentially do anything. And then if you're considering, essentially maybe taking the route that Rachel and I are doing, where you want to actually build, you're an entrepreneur and you want to do that, I think it's really important to start with a very solid business plan and map that out. It's really tough to get into an industry that's very regulated by the state laws and just to jump in and do it. I think it can be done, but I think the way that you should want to do it is with a really full baked plan.
Yeah. And I think to add to that, find out as much as you can about the industry. It's so state specific. So really get in and find out everything that you can about the laws in the state that you're interested in getting into. If you're in a state that already has a medical program or a recreational program, read those cannabis acts. You know what I mean? Like, it's a lot of legal jargon, but it will tell you everything that you need to know. And then network. It's, I am a firm believer that you have to have a community around you anytime you get into anything new, but especially the cannabis community. You know, I have found that this has been one of the most open-armed communities of any industry that I've been in to date. And so get involved, find out how you can become a part of your local organizations and start to really network and build your team up that way.
You said a word that I think is really powerful. You said network, right? And for a lot of young people in cannabis, well, anywhere right now, you can't really go to like conferences or meetups or mixers because of COVID. So what has been some of the workarounds that you ladies have found to be effective in continuing to build out your contact book or your resource list throughout COVID, not being able to have really face-to-face contact?
Yeah, this is a skill set that Rene is really, really good at. So, you know, it's been anywhere from just joining local organizations to even just going online and reaching out to people. You know, anytime we see a woman of color in the cannabis industry, or really just doing anything great in any industry, you know, whether that's, you know, when we were looking for lawyers, we were specifically looking for women of color who were lawyers interested in cannabis. So go online and meet people. It's amazing what a quick note or a DM can do, and an introductory call, just to find out what people are doing. And if you see someone that seems interesting and someone that you want to talk to, or potentially has already created a lane in the space that you're in, then reach out and talk to them. People don't do that anymore. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
I would just add that basically, you know, LinkedIn is a very powerful tool connecting people in a professional capacity. I think there's a lot of resources just in LinkedIn. Obviously, Instagram is another good one, but I think from a professional standpoint, LinkedIn has been a favorite tool of mine since I worked in sales for the WNBA. I mean, we essentially really relied on that. And so I brought that tool with me kind of wherever I've gone, and used that to leverage different organizations and specifically some other minorities in the cannabis industry as well. So, and if
Yes,
you
I
can get
agree.
on really cool podcasts and TV shows like Andrew's at Black Enterprise and Green Enterprise, it always helps, right?
It definitely works. I tell people, like, especially for like young Black people, we really undervalue LinkedIn because you're just one message away from a CEO or a VP. Like even with this content, shout out to Justin Barton, VP of partnerships at Black Enterprise. I messaged him on LinkedIn like, hey bro, how would you feel about weed content? He was like, you know what? So even LinkedIn, this whole platform came from just a conversation on LinkedIn. So I tell people you should really value the opportunity to reach out to anyone in the business world via LinkedIn. But to wrap up, ladies, I would love for you to tell our viewers where they can follow your story as well as your agency on social media.
Yes, so please go to wearedopegirls.com. It's an amazing site with a lot of different information on there as well. And there is a contact form that you can fill out to kind of link directly to us. You can find us on Instagram at we are dope girls. And we're also on LinkedIn as Dope Girls Consulting. Or you can follow me at R Chatty. And Rachel has her platform as well. Rachel, you want to tell them your...
yeah, at Pixel Space is my personal platform as well. So we welcome messages and we love connecting and meeting new people. So